Hello, everyone. This is Danny Haiphong, and this is a special edition of the Internationalist Transition on this Monday afternoon, noon Eastern Time. I am going to be joined by Stephen Gowans, and I'm going to bring him in a second. Stephen Gowans is an author, and his latest book, which is coming out this summer, this June, is The Killer's Henchman, COVID-19 and the Capitalist Disaster. And I'm going to bring him in right now so we can get started because I'm very excited. Hey, Stephen, how are you doing?
I'm good, Danny. How are you?
I am doing pretty well. So, yeah, you have written extensively about COVID-19 of late. This is a very controversial topic on the left, surprisingly so, despite being 2 years into this pandemic. A little over if we count the time where China was figuring out what was going on, and it's been about 2 years since this was declared a pandemic. So you recently wrote this article, and it's it felt like almost like a prelude to your upcoming book on COVID-19 and the capitalist disaster. But you wrote an article about how the pandemic is done except for the burials. And I want to talk about that because I feel like there is this broader atmosphere in the United States and much of the Western, European, Canada, where you are based. There's this feeling in all of these countries that it's time to get back to normal. It's time to go back to business as usual. And from where I sit in the United States, it's been business as usual for quite a long time. And the inconsistencies are real. And the number of deaths are just staggering. The United States is going to reach 1 million before the end of this month, 1 million deaths to COVID-19. Can you talk about capitalism's role in all of this? Because you really gave, I think, a very thorough analysis to all of the ways in which all of the different factors that are related to capitalism, which have created this utter disaster, this like massive death, death cult that we're living in, where so many people can die, but it just feels almost normal. So, what is this all about? And could you give some just your analysis of what you think is going on here in terms of the relationship between capitalism and this pandemic?
Yeah. One thing that really struck me as I've been watching this unfold over the last few years in the Western world is the extent to which there's been a disaster in the United States, as you pointed out, and in the United States, particularly among high income countries in the Western world, but also how that contrasted with how well China has been doing. And, it's possible to prevent pandemics. And it's possible to do that through non-pharmaceutical public health measures, which is something that China has done, and China did very early on. And in doing research for my book, I discovered that the World Health Organization had done an analysis of the world's response to the COVID pandemic. And one of the shocking findings of their analysis, or what might be considered shocking to many people, is that the World Health Organization concluded that the pandemic was not inevitable, that it was avoidable. Although they didn't point to China specifically, they did argue that it was avoidable if countries had followed the approach that China had followed. That's one way in which you can address a health emergency or a potential pandemic, is by doing the kinds of things that China did, which were non-pharmaceutical public health measures. And then it's also possible theoretically to bring a pandemic to an end through universal vaccination. But universal vaccination is problematic for a number of reasons. How do you prevent and manage a pandemic before a vaccine is developed? So in the United States, there was always this emphasis on developing a vaccine, but what were you going to do in the 12 months it took you to develop a vaccine? I mean, the only way to manage the pandemic was to impose some kind of non-pharmaceutical, public health measures, which the United States didn't do very well. Another problem with universal vaccination as an approach to the pandemic is, how do you ensure the vaccine is safe, since you're going to want to fast track it? Because I mean, if you're engulfed by a health emergency and your approach is vaccination, you need to fast track the vaccine. Well, how do you do that while ensuring it's safe? Since a lot of the safety protocols involve trials which last over, years usually. That wasn't the case here, so that becomes problematic. And then how do you achieve universal uptake? Because you probably run into vaccine resistance, as we have many countries. And then you have certain populations like adolescents and children that may be difficult to test and therefore to approve vaccines for. So you can't roll out vaccines quickly to them. Right. But this vaccine strategy has been, despite all of its problems, has been the default strategy, it seems, in countries that are yoked to capitalist imperatives and which have significant pharmaceutical industries and also the resources to heavily subsidize them. Because the vaccinations that have been produced in the United States and in the UK were all very heavily subsidized. These wouldn't have been produced if it was left to the private sector, because the private sector had discovered that vaccines weren't profitable. So government, or at least the US government, had to intervene massively with subsidies and other kinds of support to ensure that these vaccines would be produced. And also the vaccines have been produced in public or government labs. So essentially they're transferring intellectual property that is the property of US citizens, because they're the ones who funded it, and transferring it to private enterprise. Yes. So the advantage from a capitalist perspective of this vaccine strategy, as opposed to a public health strategy of the kind that China pursued, is that you avoid the costs of implementing the public health strategy, because that can be very costly. You avoid disruptions to business activity. And in a capitalist society, you don't want to disrupt the digestion of profits. And you also avoid stock market losses. And as the the Washington Post had pointed out, that one of the major reasons the Trump administration failed to act and kind of minimized the significance of the COVID threat was because Trump was afraid that this would spook the markets. So there are these three significant costs that deterred the United States from pursuing a public health strategy. But also the vaccine strategy, at the same time, then offers these profit-making opportunities for the wealthy, in vaccine production and distribution. So the vaccine strategy becomes a very attractive one to some capitalist societies, the high-income ones that have significant pharmaceutical industries. But then, there are also high-income capitalist countries that don't have significant pharmaceutical industries or the resources to heavily subsidize them. And for them, there seemed to be two possible strategies. One was to allocate resources to buying yourself to the front of the line for vaccines that are going to be produced by the vaccine powerhouse countries. So that's a strategy that was pursued, say, in Israel or in Canada, where I live. Canada, the Canadian government bought up something like, 4 times more vaccine doses than there are people in Canada. And then the other strategy was to invest in public health rather than trying to buy your way to the front of the vaccine line, which is something that was done in places like New Zealand, Japan, South Korea, and a few other countries. So they tended to follow the kind of approach that China was pursuing. It turned out not as effectively effectively as China pursued it, but they moved in that direction.
Right.
And then, of the other capitalist countries, low to mid-income capitalist countries, well, their default position was just uncontrolled transmission because they couldn't invest in vaccine production because they didn't have pharmaceutical industries. They couldn't buy their way to the front of the vaccine queue because they didn't have the resources to do that. And they weren't going to invest in public health measures because that was costly. So they had this uncontrolled transmission or living with COVID approach, such as, Brazil did. And so that seems to cover what it was that the capitalist countries were doing. But then, you had the communist-led countries, and their default position appeared to be non-pharmaceutical public health measures. That's what China did. That's what Vietnam did. Cuba started out that way, but then ran into some trouble. And there are also, too, some countries in the OECD group that pursued, China-like policies. And there was an interesting study that was done in The Lancet that compared OECD countries. So we're not looking at China or any of the communist-led countries. These are all capitalist countries. And the few countries within the OECD group pursued the so-called zero COVID approach that China had pursued very effectively. And so what the Lancet study did is it compared them to all the other countries in the OECD group who either had what is called hospital surveillance-based mitigation, which means rather than setting zero COVID cases as a goal, what you do is you set COVID cases to the limits of your healthcare system. And this is what happened in Canada, for example. So what the government would do was they'd watch the number of COVID cases and the number of COVID hospitalizations. And as that increased and started to strain hospital capacity, then they would impose these mitigation measures until the number of cases had come down. And when they came down, then they would lift those measures and then allow them to build up again. And then there are a few OECD countries that just did nothing. So what the Lancet study found, though, was the countries that pursued this kind of China-like approach did better than all the other countries in three ways. First, the rate of death was much lower than it was among all the other countries. Secondly, they did better economically because what they did was they shut down transmission very quickly and very decisively, allowing them to quickly and safely reopen their economies. And thirdly, the Lancet study noted that they had what they called better civil liberties, because what happened was they avoided this protracted cycle of lockdowns and mitigation measures because they acted quickly and decisively to suppress the infection or suppress, the spread of the virus, and that allowed them to open quickly. And this is exactly what China did. And this is one of the great advantages that China achieved. In fact, I think that what China has done is perhaps one of the greatest public health accomplishments in human history, because they've done this better than any other country has done it. I mean, much better even than those OECD capitalist countries. China, Taiwan, South Korea, all of those jurisdictions that people like to talk about that pursued zero COVID approaches did do very well. And there's no doubt about that. But none of them have done as well as China did.
Yeah, well, that's such a thorough analysis. And it's so important because I feel like in the United States, Canada, where you are, the West in general, the conversation has gone to just living with COVID. That's the strategy. We're hearing just herd immunity. They won't say those words, but that is the policy, right? All COVID-19 restrictions immediately as deaths begin to go down, they are lifted, and there is just so much conversation happening about COVID that leaves out everything that you're saying, essentially, Steve. That's why I wanted to have you on, because I am so tired of the COVID-19 discourse that's happening, and in our in our locations in the world, in the imperial orbit, we could call it, that it's just so important to remind that there is this broad situation that we need to analyze, and we need to include those countries that the United States often demonizes, and that Canada and imperialist countries often demonize, right? So China, Cuba, Vietnam, less so publicly, but it's marginalized nonetheless and not seen as really a critical or important country unless the United States is trying to organize it against China, right? That's the only time you ever hear about Vietnam. Or in the DPRK, forget about it. And I know that you wrote about the DPRK in this other very critical article of yours, which I'll definitely share in the chat with you. But you talked about the public health situations in communist-led countries, Communist Party-led countries. And you didn't just go over COVID-19 responses, although, as you said, their COVID-19 responses have been incredible, with China by far in the lead just in terms of how effective China has been. I was just on Twitter today, and there are US athletes now, more and more so, coming out and talking about how much they've had such a good time at the Beijing Olympics. And one of them happened to say that the COVID-19 protocol was incredible and that it was something to marvel. And I think it's just so interesting because through all of the demonization and the slander against China's COVID-19 response, I think one of the big reasons the Olympics was attacked in the way it was is because you would have scores of very prominent people going, these athletes going, all of their trainers, all of the staff, all of the sponsors going to Beijing and seeing the COVID-19 protocol for themselves and seeing how effective it is in keeping life as normal as possible. All of this, just living with COVID. It's China that is the place where people are living the most normally right now. They are holding the 2022 Winter Olympics. People are back to work safely. Cases are very low in China. Omicron really did not become a thing. It really didn't spread wildly because the dynamic zero COVID strategy in China is dynamic enough to ensure that these variants are cut off, that their transmission is cut off very early so that there is not too many disruptions in the economy. That's why China is going to grow at 8% this year. Like that's the reality. But I want you to talk, if you could, about the broader public health situation in these communist led countries, because you bring up some very good points about life expectancy, about just so many different measures of how people are living. And if you could talk about that, because we
Yeah.
don't really hear about this. And I think the hubris, the imperialist hubris, and the just outright anti-communism and racism that floods our societies, there's really a rejection of this. Really, all we do is look at the European, mostly white world when we're thinking about who to compare the United States to, where I sit at least.
Yeah. I've been aware of a really interesting study that was done in 1986 by a sociologist named Shirley Soresto and a physician and sociologist named Howard Waitskin. And Howard Waitskin is still publishing research. But they did a study in the American Journal of Public Health in which they compared the performance of communist-led states in capitalist countries on physical quality of life indicators. And they had 6 public health measures. So they looked at infant mortality, child death rate, life expectancy, population per physician, population per nurse, and daily per capita calorie intake. And they used World Bank data. And what they did was they compared these communist-led countries with capitalist states at the same level of economic development. And they showed that the communist countries came out ahead on all of the measures of public health. And then Waitskin was interviewed by the Los Angeles Times about this study. And they asked, well, why is it that these communist countries do so much better in terms of health? And they answered, well, the first thing a country does when it becomes socialist is improve the healthcare and education and feed the people, because that's their goal, to feed their people and get them healthcare and education. So I thought it would be interesting to kind of update this study. I mean, there are fewer communist-led countries we can look at today, but there's still a few. So I did the same. I took World Bank data and I started comparing China, Cuba, and Vietnam. I would have liked to have compared North Korea, but there's no limited World Bank data for North Korea. But I started comparing them to capitalist countries at the same level of economic development. And when you do that, what you discover is that, I mean, China, Cuba, Vietnam, they have better life expectancy than capitalist countries at the same level. They do better in terms of hospital beds per 1,000 people, much better. Take Cuba, for example. Cuba has 5.2 hospital beds per 1,000 people versus 1.6 for capitalist countries at the same level of economic development.
And I've pulled up the article so we can kind of go through these tables, because I think it's great. But yeah, continue. So I have that table up right now.
Yeah.
To see.
So, and then if you went to table 3, I mean, this looking at percentage of the population in extreme poverty. I mean, looking at the all income groups. If we look at capitalist countries, we've got about 14% living in extreme poverty versus less than 1% in communist countries.
Yeah, that's a stunning number, given the fact that, and it's so important that development is controlled here, in terms of, because capitalist countries, of course, given their imperialist character, they've been able to grow so rich off the backs of exploitation. But we see here that when you control for that, the standards of living are just higher. I mean, that just shows that standards of living are higher when you have so many more extremely impoverished people in capitalist countries. It's a staggering number, and I think it really flies in the face of what we hear about these communist party-led countries versus their capitalist counterparts. But yeah, table 4, what does this go over? The Human Development Index?
Yeah, so that's directly addressing what you're talking about. If we just want to look at human development, I mean, if we look at communist countries as a whole versus capitalist countries as a whole, we see a higher level of human development.
Yep.
And in some cases, I mean, the difference is substantial, say, comparing Vietnam to other low-income countries.
Yeah, definitely.
So,
and then managing COVID, you get into as well.
Yeah, and these numbers have changed since I looked at them. But if you went through them at that point, I mean, all of these countries, China, Cuba, Vietnam, were doing far better than capitalist countries at the same level of income. Even, I mean, China just does far better than anyone, period. It doesn't matter what level of income they're at. And in fact, interestingly, China is a huge anomaly in terms of COVID performance. And so is the United States, but there are anomalies in different ways. I mean, if you compare China to the world average, it's so much better than the world average. I mean, there is no country except for various jurisdictions with very low populations that do better than China. The United States, on the other hand, is one of the worst in the world in terms of COVID performance. It just has execrable COVID numbers. So there's quite a contrast there. And one of the things that I point out repeatedly in the book that I wrote was, and this is a really frustrating thing, it is always U.S. experts who are pointed to in the Western world or the U.S. orbit as the go-to people on how to handle the pandemic.
Yeah.
And yet in the United States was doing worse than almost everyone else. And I argued, if you wanted to know how to deal with the pandemic, you should have been talking to someone in China,
Right.
because apparently
Yeah. How
the
about the
Chinese
head
knew
of the
how to deal with it.
CDC or in China from the very beginning, right? That would have been probably warranted. Um, but what did we get? I mean, what did we get? We had Biden before he was elected during the Trump era into the Biden administration now. Just kept, all he could say. This was the leftmost narrative about COVID in China at the time. This was during the 2020 election. All we had him saying was, "Oh, we need to go send our inspectors to Wuhan so this doesn't happen again." Right? It's just the same hubris, like this, which to me, it almost sounds, that sounds like war, right? When you're saying we need to send inspectors to watch over those Chinese. I mean, it sounds like it's a pretty aggressive policy that you're suggesting, but nonetheless, that's all we got, right? In terms of communication and contact with China. In China, I don't know if you remember this, Stephen. Early in the pandemic, China was sending masks, and it's still happening. I mean, China produces all of the masks and produces a lot of these necessary equipment that you need. But early on, like literal donations, like, hey, we're trying to help you out, both the states and the federal government. No appreciation, though.
Yeah. Well, yeah. I can understand perhaps why people who live in the United States might be a little bit jingoistic and assume that anything that the United States does is superior to what anyone else does. But I mean, if you wanted to do this dispassionately and objectively and look at the figures, you would have seen, okay, so the Chinese are doing something that's really working. Mm-hmm. So why don't we look at what it is the Chinese are doing and try and emulate what they're doing? But we saw none of that. And I found early on, if you ever wanted to broach the subject of how well China was doing, the typical response was to say, well, I don't believe those Chinese numbers.
Yes.
Which isn't an argument. It's just, no. I don't even want to talk about this. I noticed that in the media, there's now an acknowledgement that, in fact, China has done well, although the extent to which it's done well is never actually acknowledged. Mm-hmm. Oh, well, they've done well. But I mean, if you actually look at the numbers, the disparity between China and the United States is just overwhelming. It's incredible, astonishing. I mean, but that's never acknowledged. But they will acknowledge that China has done very well. But now the argument is, well, yeah, that might be the case. And yeah, it's true that the Chinese population is behind Beijing and they support this zero COVID policy, but it's just impractical.
Yes. It could never happen here is what you'll see, which is, I think, a stunning argument to make publicly, right? To say it could never happen here. And it's almost assuming, and I think some of this assumption is correct, that a lot of people value these, we write about it all the time, these like exceptionalist Western capitalist values, individualism, freedom, liberty. They value these individual freedoms so much that they won't question, well, hey, it would have been nice if 1 million people didn't die of COVID-19 in a country of 300 million.
Yeah, and I find that analysis to be very superficial, but there are a lot of people committed to that view that you could never do that in a place like the United States or maybe even Canada. But I mean, if you look at some of the polling numbers and public opinion numbers, you see that in Canada, for example, there's a fair degree of support for COVID mitigation measures. And there is also substantial support in the United States.
Yeah.
So this appears, I don't know, it's a myth invoked across all spectrums, or across the political spectrum, it seems, in the United States, to say, oh, this policy is just impossible. And yet, again, going back to the Lancet study, when you look at OECD countries that tried to emulate China, what you find is they had better so-called civil liberties. I mean, they had more freedoms. They experienced fewer lockdowns and fewer restrictions and less mitigation. And in fact, there was a really interesting story. It was in the New York Times, I think somewhere around the summer of 2021, when in a number of Western countries, there are still lockdowns and all kinds of mitigation measures that many people were complaining about. And this article was talking about China and saying, well, you know what? In China, they don't have these things. Life has seemed to return to normal. People don't do Zoom calls. In fact, they get together and they talk. They go to restaurants and they meet, and all of these restrictions that we still have in the West, they don't have in China. And then it pointed out that there's was a debate in the West between was the economy or saving lives. And in China, it was discovered or shown that this was a false dichotomy, that you could do both. You could save lives and you could also safely reopen your economy if you wanted to pursue these kinds of non-pharmaceutical interventions, public health interventions, old-fashioned epidemiology 101. In fact, the British Medical Journal had an article about what China did and said China didn't do anything that was extraordinary. They just did epidemiology 101, but they did it well. And they demonstrated that you could avoid a pandemic by implementing these simple measures. Mm-hmm. But we didn't do that in the capitalist world because we invested in the vaccine strategy. And I think even the World Health Organization has talked endlessly about how you cannot vaccinate yourself out of a pandemic, which isn't saying that vaccines are wrong or that vaccines are not effective or that you shouldn't use vaccines, only saying that you can't vaccinate that vaccines alone are not a magic bullet. In fact, in my book, I show just dozens and dozens and dozens of epidemiologists and vaccinologists and infectious disease experts who've said over and over that vaccines are not a magic bullet. And yet that was the strategy pursued in the United States. It's a magic bullet. That's all we need. We need vaccines. Everything be put behind us. And now we've discovered that, in fact, it didn't do the work, didn't do the job. Because they didn't follow the advice of the World Health Organization that you need, both in the United States anyway, right, vaccines plus public health measures to be able to address this problem. So now, because no one's willing in the US and many Western countries to pursue public health measures, and the vaccine strategy hasn't worked, so what do you have left? Nothing, which means why you go with the living with COVID strategy, which is essentially an admission of failure, or an admission that you're not going to, under a capitalist system and under the yoke of capitalist imperatives, it's impossible to address this problem.
Right. Yeah. I mean, in New York State alone, there were such terrible cuts to hospital beds, hospitals, hospital closures that happened under the Cuomo administration for all the years that he was in office. And then even before that, that the New York State, New York City was in no way prepared to handle such a public health calamity that was COVID-19. And that's not changing, because during the height, I don't even want to say height, because it seems like there is no height to this pandemic. When it comes to the United States, there's just a constant stream of cases and deaths. But during the early phase of the pandemic, there was massive cuts to Medicaid. Andrew Cuomo cut Medicaid, right? He cut that, and that included cuts to hospital funding. So there you go. More cuts, even while thousands upon thousands upon thousands of people were dying in New York City alone, not to mention the entire state. But this gets into something that you were saying, Stephen, about these non-pharmacological interventions, which have been framed by now, unfortunately, most people, no matter what side of the political spectrum you're on, frame them as authoritarian, quote unquote, frame them as repressive, right? There's this large trend in that way. And look, this is really, especially in the United States, the doing of capitalism and US capitalism, especially, but it's true in Canada, it's true in other places. These inconsistent measures, the massive deaths, it really opened the floodgates to this ideological reaction. Now, as you said, most people don't see these mitigation measures as worth it. And a lot of them openly oppose them. And most people don't trust their governments. And that's a huge problem. And I think it gets back to what we were talking about with the Communist Party like countries. Those countries have a deep amount of public trust. So could you speak to this and like, how do we shift the narrative? Because I feel like the narrative is completely just, it's like gone off the deep end with the topic in particular. But I feel like your work is a necessary shift in a lot of ways. So if you could just talk about that.
Yeah, I mean, that's, I should say about mitigation measures and public acceptance or rejection of them. I think there's this myth developing that most people are fed up with mitigation measures and don't want them. And that is why we have movements such as the occupation movement that's going on with the so-called truckers convoy in Ottawa. But, and, you could say that there are a bunch of Canadians that are just fed up with mitigation measures, and that's why you have a truckers convoy. But if you look at all the polling data, it suggests that the substantial majority of Canadians accept mitigation measures as a necessity. They might not like them, but they say we still need them. And it is a minority that says, no, it's time to lift all of these measures. Interestingly, about this so-called truckers convoy, it's the only so-called grassroots pro-democratic pro-working class movement that's endorsed by the Wall Street Journal, is endorsed by all of the far right political parties in Canada, but is opposed by the country's unions. So I mean, that's kind of that characterization of that movement as, this grassroots rejection of mitigation measures is probably wrong. But one thing that I do argue in my book is I have a whole chapter on pharmaceutical industry and capitalist pharmacy and the problems with capitalist pharmacy. And there are immense problems with capitalist pharmacy, and there are valid and legitimate reasons to be suspicious of capitalist pharmacy, because capitalist pharmacy is interested in one thing. It's interested in generating profits, not interested in producing, drugs and vaccines or therapeutics that are going to enhance public health. I mean, that's an advantage if they do, and that doesn't mean that big pharma doesn't produce effective drugs and vaccines, but that's not the aim. The aim is to produce profits. And if you can produce profits, even though you produce a bunch of junk that is either deleterious to public health or has no impact, you still do it. So there is a reason why people ought to be suspicious about big pharma. They should be skeptical about vaccines. Being skeptical, though, doesn't mean rejecting them. Being skeptical doesn't mean that it might be the case, and I believe it is the case, that vaccines are effective, and it turns out, it seems now, that they're safe as well. But if you contrast that with the way things ought to be, I mean, if you had a pharmacy in a socialist country in which the aim of pharmacy is not to produce profits, but to meet public health requirements, then the reasons to be suspicious are far less acute. I mean, also, if you have a pharmaceutical industry that's answerable to, a democratic democratically regulated, regulatory agency, you're more likely to have confidence in the kinds of drugs that are being produced. I mean, there is some concern in the United States, for example, of the regulatory agencies being subjected to what's called industry capture. So the FDA commissioners and the people who work in the FDA are often appointed from the industry, and they have industry objectives. So, I mean, if people are suspicious of big pharma in capitalist countries, well, there are good reasons to be suspicious. There's less reasons to be suspicious in communist or socialist countries because those pharmaceutical industries are not yoked to capitalist imperatives.
Yes.
And I think what you were referring to, some study and work that suggests that in the communist countries, you don't see this kind of popular reaction to vaccines, or the suspicion that vaccines are harmful and anything that big pharma says is necessarily wrong.
Yeah. And yeah, exactly. And an early example of the fact that socialist countries, the Communist Party-like countries that we've been referring to here, an early example of how those their biotech, their pharmaceutical industries, how they're not wedded to profit. You saw that early on between Cuba and China with the exchange of interferon, like critical antiviral medication that saved a lot of lives in China during the early days of their battle with COVID-19. And just that alone, that kind of cooperation is just an example. That kind of cooperation doesn't bring huge amounts of dollars to either country's private sector, but it brings immense social benefits, including preserving tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of lives in the city of Wuhan alone. So I think that's just such a good point, and it's one that needs to be emphasized because the conversation, as you said, there are a lot of people who want, just like there are a lot of people in the United States who want Medicare for all. Like Medicare for all would be a huge policy. A universal healthcare policy would be a huge one in pandemic mitigation as well. It would have saved a lot of lives. Most people want that. Most people want to survive. They want to live. Then they will, if you are clear, if political leadership is clear about how to do that, people will do it because it's for the collective good. But we do have this vocal minority and the political power behind it that has, I think, muddled the conversation so much. So we're not talking about everything I think we've been talking about here.
You mentioned, you were talking about the cuts in New York, which kind of reminded me of, or called to my mind anyway, something about the DPRK and something else as well. I mean, early on we heard about the, what do we call it? Crush the curve, bend the curve, flatten the curve. The flatten the curve strategy. And what was omitted from that is that strategy was originally called flatten the curve and raise the line. Raise the line referred to increasing hospital resources at the same time you were trying to flatten the curve. But you mentioned about how hospital resources and medical resources were being diminished and depleted. At the same time, you're facing this influx of patients with COVID. Concerning the DPRK, Howard Waitskin, who I mentioned earlier, who was involved in that 1986 study looking at communist versus capitalist countries in healthcare, wrote a article in Monthly Review in which he looked at the way in which countries, particularly, I think he emphasized Vietnam, and looked at how they were dealing with COVID. But he also talked about the DPRK. And his view was the DPRK probably leads the world in terms of its success in dealing with COVID because essentially very early on it closed its borders in order to keep the virus out. And the DPRK claims that it's had no COVID cases, and Waitskin thought, well, that seems to be credible, their claim. And, newspapers like the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal have all acknowledged that the DPRK has this extraordinarily hypersensitive COVID policy. But now, others have been pointing out, well, the reason that they've been so hyper vigilant about COVID is because their healthcare system is so weak that if they had a COVID outbreak, their healthcare system would completely collapse. And that's a negative way to look at it. But a positive way to look at it is that the DPRK is a low-income country. So what did other low-income countries do? They didn't close their borders. They left their borders open. They did essentially nothing, and their healthcare systems collapsed, and they had this calamity in which millions of people died. So, I think that points out one of the key differences between communist-led countries and capitalist-led countries at the same level of development. The DPRK decided that it was going to protect its citizens. Capitalist countries at the same level of development said, well, we'll have uncontrolled transmission, and if a lot of people died, so be it. So, and also, I should point out that one of the reasons that the DPRK's healthcare system is so weak, it's because this country has been subjected to more sanctions than any other country in the world, and for a much longer period. It has a poor healthcare system because essentially of the United States.
Right. Yeah. The sanctions on the DPRK are brutal. They are universal, and they really do isolate the DPRK economically from much of the world market, capitalist and otherwise. So it's important to recognize that and to factor that into why the DPRK was so vigilant. And I remember reading Korean state media, the DPRK state media, around that time when China was battling the initial phases of COVID-19 in 2020, early 2020, and it was kind of incredible. It was like immediate quarantine measures, close the border with China, and immediate disinfecting, immediate mitigation. And you don't hear anything about the DPRK, but I think what you said is so critical, because we don't hear about massive deaths and destruction of the economy and just disruption of the healthcare system, all of that, because the DPRK was so vigilant. And we can all guarantee that if that were the case, and there would be people able to get this out to the public. I hate this idea that the DPRK is a hermit kingdom. You can't get anything out of there. Well, if the United States wanted to, they would. And I think there's just not a real possibility of doing that. And I think that it just shows how incredibly DPRK and all these other socialist countries have performed. But I want to shift gears for the last 10, 15 minutes, Stephen, to now, because you've also commented on this. And I think it's important to get into this because it is a very dangerous situation that the U.S., a dangerous game the U.S. and its NATO allies are playing around the hyping up of Ukraine and a possible Russian invasion. Have any comments on that? Because it doesn't seem to go away. This has happened. You pointed this out in your article. It happens all the time. It's almost like a yearly thing now where the U.S. leaks into its media and the Western media. There's this Russian invasion coming, but this one seems to be sticking around a bit. So what's going on? Why is this story ongoing, even though it's not only unlikely, but not really, it's not going to happen? But why does it stick around? Why do we keep getting told by Biden and the U.S. and all of their allies that Russia is going to invade Ukraine?
Yeah. And Biden seems to be the only one. Biden and Blinken seem to be the only ones who believe that Russia is going to invade Ukraine. But even they don't believe it. Blinken keeps saying, well, I can't see into, Putin's mind, so I don't know if he's going to make that decision. But I think this has a lot to do with, weakening not only Russia, but weakening Europe. And Europe is also part of this.
Yeah.
The Europeans, the French and the Germans, have an interest in integrating their economies with Russia, which is not something the United States wants. The United States would prefer that European economies remained integrated with that of the United States, and that Europe remained subordinate to the United States. So Europe's been talking about strategic autonomy, having some latitude to make decisions independent of the United States, which is not something Washington likes, because France, Germany, these had, prior to World War II, been imperialist competitors of the United States, and could still be imperialist competitors of the United States if the United States allows them to be. And, a lot of the post-World War II history of U.S. relations with Europe is a history of how the United States tries to dominate Europe and keep those former imperialist competitors under control.
Yes. Yeah.
And this is part of that. And one of the things that I think is really central to this is the Nord Stream 2 pipeline, which is the new pipeline bringing natural gas from Russia to Germany and bypassing Ukraine. Ukraine currently says that Nord Stream 2 is as much of an existential threat to Ukraine as is a Russian invasion. And so how does this figure into this? You recall that the White House has been pressuring Germany to commit to canceling Nord Stream 2 if there's a Russian invasion. And
fully constructed Nord Stream 2, cancel it. That's what they wanted from Germany.
And then take liquid natural gas imports from the United States in place of getting natural gas from Russia, even though the liquid natural gas imports from the United States would be far more expensive.
Far more, yes.
But that's part of being part of the U.S. empire, isn't it? If you're Germany, if you're France, if you're part of the U.S. empire, that means that U.S. interests come first and your interests are subordinated to U.S. interests, which may be one of the reasons why countries like Germany and France and Japan have lower GDPs per capita than does the United States, because in the U.S. empire, it's always corporate USA that's going to do better than anyone else. For those countries, their interests ultimately must be subordinated to those of corporate America. So it may be that the United States is trying to draw Russia into a conflict. The United States wouldn't care because the U.S. doesn't intend to get involved in this conflict. Washington will fight Russia to the last Ukraine. But if Russia does become embroiled in a conflict, that will weaken Russia. And it'll also allow Washington to pressure Germany to cancel that Nord Stream 2 contract. It'll allow them to put pressure on France not to do deals with Russia and to reorient in a much stronger way toward the United States.
Right. It's a real de-development strategy through military means. That's what it feels like for Europe, being caught in the middle of the United States in its aggressive policy toward Russia. Look at what's happened to Europe over the last several decades. The austerity has really arrested development. Europe, a lot of these European countries had infrastructure, still do to a certain degree, but had infrastructure that was, I think, really looked at as impressive and beyond what the United States had just 40 years ago, right? In terms of the rail system and public infrastructure, a robust public sector, all of that is basically gone. And it's because of just decades long of being a junior partner to the United States and having to succumb to the pressure of the international financial system, which offers all of these and imposes all of these conditionalities onto European countries, all of them, Eastern Europe to Western Europe, the whole gambit. We saw what happened to Greece, prior to the Trump era. We saw what happened there. I mean, it's just across the board. This austerity is a killer. It is literally a killer. And the U.S., I feel like, is trying to impose austerity onto Europe as it is drumming up this threat of quote unquote war, or this so-called invasion that isn't going to, there's not going to be an invasion. The Russia's not going to do that. That would be completely anathema to its own interests to spark a global conflict. And they always say in the corporate media and the Biden administration too that, oh, this isn't about NATO. We're not trying to admit Ukraine into NATO. Ukraine has a choice. It has a choice. It can choose who it wants to align with, but it should align with us. And if it wants to be in NATO, that would be great. The problem with that analysis, though, is that the U.S. was the one that staged the coup in 2014, which installed this far-right government full of neo-Nazis, which today an NBC report is now going viral because they were covering a so-called grandmother who was practicing shooting, who was practicing using arms with a so-called, a paramilitary group in Ukraine, happened to be the Azov Battalion, the neo-Nazi group, and is going viral on Twitter because of just how much that reveals the true character of what's going on. But still, I think the U.S. is showing in its actions here, if you repeat a lie long enough, it becomes truth. And there are so many reasons internally too, domestically, that the U.S. kind of needs this. There really isn't nothing to write home about domestically at this moment either. The Biden administration is struggling big time, just in terms of leading into this midterms, then leading into 2024. But yeah, I mean, in terms of the situation with Ukraine, how do you see this all playing out in the end? And what do you think is the end game here? Because it seems unlikely that there will be a global confrontation, although you can't ever say never with the U.S. But what do you think is the end game here? Do you think it'll work?
Well, I'm reluctant to make any predictions because they'll almost certainly be wrong. I mean, there could be a global conflict. I don't certainly want one intended. One could come about. I think it's a low probability, but one could come about through some error or accident. But, as I said, I think that ultimately, it would serve U.S. purpose for Russia to be drawn into a war in Ukraine or an intervention. And the United States would probably welcome that. It would never say it welcomed that, but certainly is behaving in a way that is provocative and would invite a Russian intervention. I mean, they keep talking about, what is there, 100,000 Russian troops deployed near the Ukrainian border.
Yes.
What they don't talk about is there are 175,000 NATO troops deployed near Russian western borders. I mean, we could look at it that way as well. So, I mean, it's hard to say what will come about. It doesn't look like Russia's taking the bait as much as I think Biden would like him to take the bait. It's certainly clear that the United States, though, has no interest in arriving at any modus vivendi with Russia. No interest in providing security guarantees, no interest in averting war.
Yeah, you mentioned that Russia has been very forthright with its demands, and they're not really demands. They were just requests, right? Like, can you do X, Y, Z? Could you talk about that a little more to close? Because I think that's really important, because Russia is being seen as the aggressor, predictably. Yeah. But we're not talking about, well, how has Russia behaved? And I think they've been very reasonable.
Yeah, and I mean, the Russians keep pointing out that you cannot have security by undermining someone else's security, and that's what you're doing. You're trying to undermine our security. So they proposed two treaties, one to the United States, one to the NATO countries, which are very reasonable treaties. They're treaties which essentially said, let's agree not to fight. That's what they said. Let's agree that we're going to provide security to each side. We're not going to launch attacks against each other. We're not going to use the territory of other countries to launch attacks. We're not going to be provocative. And these treaties were just peremptorily dismissed. And so, as the Russian side points out now, the United States doesn't seem to be interested at all. They just dismissed our efforts to, diffuse this tension. And if anything, they just keep taking steps to escalate the tension.
Right. Well, thanks, Stephen, for coming on. This was a really good conversation. When your book comes out, I believe, what is that, in less than 6 months? I said six, I believe, but June, correct? Your book is coming out?
Yeah, officially on June 1st.
Great. Yeah, we should talk again. We'll see where the situation is at that moment. I'm sure it's going to be applicable, knowing the direction that our places of residence are going in. But where can people find your work?
They can find it on gowins.blog, wordpress.gowins.blog.
Great. Yeah, I've linked that in the description of this video, so you can definitely follow his work as he gets closer to the launch of his new book, and of course, follow all of his other books. You've written about Korea, about Syria. I mean, I've read your book on Syria, book on Israel. They are critical. They are, if you want short, very detailed analyses of what's going on in Syria, the long war on Syria, what is the true character of Israel, and what in the context of history. It's those works are just very valuable resources. So go check Stephen out. But thanks so much, Stephen. I'm going to be sticking around for a half hour, but we'll be in touch, Stephen. I appreciate you coming on today.
Thank you very much, Danny.
Bye.
It's great. Thanks.
Take care. All right. So, yeah, stick around, everybody. I'm going to be on for another 30 minutes. Stephen Gowans, a incredible intellectual, analyst, leftist, someone who I have read and will continue to read because he is very prolific, and I look forward to his new work, and I need to catch up with his other works too, especially his joint on Korea, because I need a refresher, and that could have been the topic for today, but I definitely want to get a DPRK stream very soon. But anyway, hey everybody, I'll be on for another half hour. It's really good to be with you. Please stick around. Please continue to like the stream. Please do subscribe to my Patreon to support this show and to support all of my work. Also, subscribe for free on my Substack. And if you prefer annual subscriptions, you can do that there. I have an article launching today on China, and the article is actually countering Dave Zirin and his colleague Jules Boykins and their coverage of the Olympics. A real short one. I mean, my article is short, brief, but in terms of Zirin's piece, it just didn't feel genuine. They wrote about the Beijing 2022 Winter Olympics. It was less than 1,000 words that they spent on it, and there were so many concessions to the imperialists that I felt obliged to come up with a new term called the China exception for the American left, which essentially just means what it sounds like. China is the exception to the rule of progressivism. China doesn't deserve solidarity. That is how China is treated by much of the American left, and it is evident in their coverage. So you can go check that out on my Substack. It's coming out in about 3 hours, and I'll be plugging that later this afternoon and evening. And I've been writing a lot, as you may know. I think I've had in the last 6 days that this will be my third article. So, if you appreciate this work, please do Support it financially if you can. Patreon.com/Danny Haiphong. But yeah, let's just chat. Do you have any questions about what you heard? This is a controversial topic now. I don't know why. I don't know why COVID-19, why I know why to some degree there's a lot of censorship that goes on here about it. And you can't talk about certain things and they take off your stream. But for me, what I like to focus on with COVID-19 is what I've been focusing on since the very beginning. And what Stephen writes about is what is actual public health? What is it? What does it mean to actually respond to a pandemic that's in the interest of working class people? And I am not of the opinion that just let her rip is the correct solution. I was not of the opinion of that 2 years ago, and I'm still not of that opinion, given that there are a lot of people dying of COVID-19 still. And also, for those who like to say, well, people also die of other things, well, we need to address those things too, right? If you're talking about car crashes, well, we need to be driving less cars. We need to have high speed rail in the United States. If you're talking about heart attacks, heart disease, well, that's also a problem of capitalism as well, because it's capitalism that's making us sick with this absolutely horrific food that corporate factory farms, etc., are feeding us and pushing down our throats, and the overworked, overstressed lifestyles because of the super exploitation of our labor. We need to also address that too. So I don't see those as valid arguments at all. Anyway, I'm going to get to your questions because I thought this was a great conversation, though. So really salute to Stephen for coming on today. So here's where. How you doing? Have you been following the news regarding the 15-year-old Russian figure skater doping accusations, and do you feel it's connected to the current geopolitical issues with Russia and the West? I have been only sort of on the surface. I've been seeing stories about it. I know this comes from Sochi. There was this huge scandal that happened during the Sochi Olympics. There was a politicized attack on Russia during that as well around doping. And this is just a continued policy of it. And I feel like, right, there was a lot of demonization of the 2014 Sochi Olympics. And to this day, I believe because of this specific instance, but I think most athletes who participate, they're not allowed to participate in the gold medal ceremonies if they win. It's a complete and utter geopolitical move. And it just goes to show that these Olympic Games are often used by the imperialists as a way to assert their hegemony. And so, yeah, it's disgusting. It needs to end. Russia needs to be treated like an equal player on the world stage, and we need to be advocating for that. We cannot be afraid of being called Russian assets or dupes of Russia. We have like a gender report when this was happening, when the late Glenn Ford was still alive, and we were talking about Russia Gay. We said it's a badge of honor to be called an asset of Russia because it means that we are talking about the right things and that we are on the right side of history. It means that what we say is actually threatening to the establishment and that we are for peace, we are against imperialism, and we know what solidarity is all about. So we need to continue to push forward with that because these imperialists, the United States and its allies, they are looking to destabilize Russia. That is one of the objectives. That's one of the end games in this whole Olympic doping scandal. It's all part of it. It's all part of the propaganda war that continues on to this very day. So let me move on. It says, all right, how much of it is due to the prevalence of Trotskyist labeling of China as a deformed worker state? So I don't know if there was a question before that. Maybe it was while I was speaking, but I understand what you're saying in terms of this rejection of China. And yeah, no, that's a common thing you hear in Trotskyist circles. I mean, the vast majority of socialist organizations, unfortunately, take this. I can only think of a few: PSL, Workers' World, some others that don't take this absolutely incorrect and honestly racist position, right? To use this term deformed worker state means that these socialists somehow think they know what a worker state is. Last time I checked, the United States, the United Kingdom, Canada, we can go across the board. Last time I checked, none of them have ever lived under a worker state. None of them have ever built a worker state. None of them have ever really fought for a worker state. And none of them have studied history correctly, because if you understand how this brand of Trotskyism works, it goes Vladimir Lenin was a cool guy, right, from 1917 to about 1922. And then after he died, everything went to garbage. Everything went up in flames, and Stalin was terrible, and everything about the Soviet Union was awful at that time. All of the good things about socialism went up in flames, and yet somehow the Soviet Union survived until 1991, and it just so happened to become an economic powerhouse, defeat the Nazis, and also raise the standard of living in the Soviet Union, the republics of the Soviet Union, to an immense degree, 2 to 3 times. Oh yeah, no, socialism was terrible. It was a deformed worker state. There was no quote unquote democracy. I mean, it just sounds like the Department of State, right? It just sounds like the State Department cosplaying as socialists. And so, yeah, I mean, the rejection of China in a lot of ways by so-called communists and socialists who follow this deformed worker state line, they are so blinded by their prejudices that they can't see the forest from the trees. They can't see the vast achievements. And they claim that they stand with the Chinese people and Chinese workers. They claim to stand with workers in Cuba. They claim to stand with workers in the DPRK, but they won't defend these very same workers from imperialism. They won't oppose it. They won't come out to the rallies. They won't organize any rallies. They won't even, in the Zirin article, just like in the David Klein article in The Nation, and he's not anywhere close to a Marxist, but Dave Zirin does identify on the socialist spectrum of the political, of the in the political realm. He doesn't mention U.S. aggression really at all. He doesn't talk about the militarism. He doesn't talk about the sanctions. He doesn't talk about any of it. It's like it's an omission. But he will say that Mike Tirico, this corporate hack, who's just literally regurgitating humanitarian interventionist lies, these human rights atrocity propaganda, he says that, oh, that's great. He's not brave for doing it, but they addressed the elephant in the room, is how he and his colleague put it. But you can check out the article later. But yeah, a lot of this has to do with how socialists, especially white socialists in these organizations, I won't say they're all white, but their leadership certainly adopt a politically white orientation to the world, meaning an imperialist, a racist orientation to the world socialist movement. And because of that, they cannot be effective. They are honestly infantile. They are infantile. They are irrelevant in a lot of ways politically, insofar as any kind of human progress is concerned. Now, they are of course relevant in the sense that they carry water for imperialists, and so they make our job a lot harder. But let's see if there's any other questions here. Thank you for that one. So let's see. Thank you so much anyway while you're waiting. So here we go. So Josh DB said, Dan, you're absolutely right. The questions of what is public health and what is the socialist world doing are both critical for the Western left and heavily ignored, very myopic US centrism. So I thought that was a question, but Josh, thank you for that comment. So, because I agree with that, so to speak, definitely. But yeah, let's see. I don't see any other questions. So yeah, we should call them imperialists. That's exactly what these Trotskyists are, so-called communists. You are correct in that. I don't see. Here we go. Okay, so there's a lot of conversation happening. But yeah, I mean, so we can just talk then. I'll just, kind of close it out for the last 15 minutes here. and just say that now, I've been doing a lot of thinking. It's the reason why I've been doing a lot of writing. There there's a historical moment kind of underway right now. We are in an epical moment. We are in a transitionary moment. We are in a very polarizing moment. And I've been thinking about all of the discourse that has been happening about COVID, reason why I want to have this stream today, but just the state of the left in general. And I'm a revolutionary optimist, so I believe actually the situation is optimistic. But there is a divergent trend happening that I definitely want you all to be aware of where I stand. When this is sort of a maybe a lesson in dialectical materialism as well, the Marxist philosophy. When a society, when a social order, when a political economy like the United States is on the decline, when its contradictions are becoming irreconcilable, and when they are spilling over into the antagonistic phase, the phase of antagonism, where there will be social transformation. When that is occurring at the level of the ruling class, which it is, right? There's a crisis of legitimacy, there's economic catastrophe, erosion, stagnation, there's endless militarism, but that endless militarism is only heightening the contradictions on the world stage, pushing Russia and China together, leading to disastrous conditions for humanity across the world, and also not necessarily achieving US objectives to the degree that I think much of the ruling class would hope. For example, much of the ruling class would hope that US soft power could do the trick. That just during World War II, Stephen kind of mentioned this, that during the world wars and where the US came out afterward, that it would be this kind of hegemony, this stability, this stable hegemony that would rule the day. And this is what most of the capitalist class wants. Now, of course, imperialists, the capitalists, they are no stranger to wars. They are not afraid of wars. They lust for wars in a lot of ways. However, when those wars lack any kind of precision, strategy, and when they cannot achieve the objectives that they're supposed to achieve, for example, Libya 2011 becoming a basket case, being turned into a failed state, being turned into a divided state, being turned into a state so much in chaos that it cannot, let's say, pump oil for the capitalists. When that happens, then there's something else going on. There is a crisis afoot, and the empire is outstretched and it is unable to maintain any kind of stability. It is both outstretched and seen as the terrorist entity that it is. And so that's the revolutionary optimistic part of this whole era that we're living in, is that we are in a moment where much of the world is seeing this, and the outcomes of imperialism are speaking for themselves. And so the reason why it is so critical to cover what we cover today, COVID-19, looking at China, looking at these other socialist countries, when we look at issues like Russia and Ukraine, the US escalations there, when we look at the new Cold War on China, it is important to understand that there is more than one side to this issue. That's the dialectics of it. That it's not just that the imperialists are sending us into the spirals of death, into climate catastrophe, economic calamity, and endless war, but it's also that there are forces for peace out there that are fighting for it and that are honestly showing us what it looks like. That is what the Russia China partnership is about. That is what the fight for multipolarity is all about. That is what the Belt and Road Initiative is all about. The Eurasian Economic Union is all about. That is the other side of this, right? And so we need to keep that in mind and we need to make it central in our work. And that's what I try to do in my work and try to convince others to do the same in theirs. Because as I said before, I get really frustrated with the discourse on COVID-19, the discourse on the left on damn near everything. And we have to stay focused and try to push back against the grain and have actual discussions that will lead in fruitful directions for the movement. And I think that, this was one today. And, I will continue to have them with you all as I continue this work. But yeah, continue to like the stream, continue to hit the like button, subscribe if you haven't subscribed, and of course to support the show if you can. It's all in the description wherever you want to just support. One-time donations are available. Patreon.com/Danny Haiphong for any amount on a monthly basis is better. Helps sustain this work. But I'm going to look through the chat, see if there's any other questions before I close this up for the last 10 minutes. I don't see any other questions, I don't think. Oh, here we go. Josh again. Hello, Josh. How do you feel about the International Committee, DSA's International Committee strives toward anti-imperialism? Yeah. That's an interesting point. I know some folks in the International Committee, DSA, and I think they're doing good work, right? And I'm not surprised that they're getting the slander, and I know it's causing, I know from my contacts in the DSA International Committee that it is causing internal conflict. And it's important. I'm loving it. We need to continue to do that. So for those who had the energy and the time to really spend on participating in the DSA's International Committee, I think it's done a lot of good work because their positions, their recent statement on Ukraine and NATO and this escalation of aggression by the United States toward Russia, their positions on China and the new Cold War have been very solid. And on these critical questions, they are really, at least in terms of their influence and impact, they're helping to publicize a lot of the things that we're talking about and that I'm talking about here. So certainly appreciate that and appreciate that struggle, because I do think, I'm actually a little, look, there's movement building and there's algorithm baiting, right? There's two different things. So there's some on here who like to go on and talk about the DSA is crap and garbage. And look, I have a lot of criticisms of the DSA as an overall organization. I have been vocal about them, but I try to keep it to politics, right? This is about the political positions, the activity, the significance for the movement when you do side with imperialism, for example. Yeah, like I am going to call that out. However, I am not going to burn the efforts of, I know people who have joined the DSA who are good people. I know people who are trying to do the work internally. And we need to have a very open mind about all of the different strategies that are at our disposal. And some people have chosen to go into the DSA and try to organize people in the correct direction, organize those in the correct direction. So those who keep saying like, oh, they're all just PMCs, professional managerial classes, they're all just soy boys, there are no workers in it, which is ridiculous because there are a lot of union members, a lot of workers in DSA. There are a lot of workers in a lot of socialist organizations. I cannot fathom that position being as like a universal label. I get it to some degree because there are a lot of gentrifier leftists out there, and unfortunately, they happen to be in the lead. But we cannot just talk about everyone in the same manner. We have to be precise, and we have to keep this about politics. I know it's better for the algorithm if I were to go on here and DSAs, all soy boys and PMCs and that is not the correct strategy. If you want to be relevant to the movement, you have to be able to talk to people. You can't just talk to you can't just talk to people who agree with you. I've been in several unions and most people are not anywhere close to where DSA is at politically in terms of their open consciousness, their desire and ability to fight. So you have to talk to them in a language where they will be convinced to come to you, where they will be convinced to follow you. That's political leadership. That is how you develop communist leadership is you build organizations that serve as the vanguard, and you approach the masses in a way that can move them. And you can say, oh, well, there's no masses in the DSA. There are no masses in any of those organizations. Well, that's just ridiculous. That's just a blatant, like, brush. That's not true. We have to approach masses who are in organizations and who are not in organizations. You have to do all of it. And you cannot be in these open, like, these just constant conflicts publicly. Like, who does it serve? Right? It doesn't serve us. We have a ruling class to fight. We have a class struggle to wage. And there are always moments and opportunities where we can confront these forces when they are in our way. That is how you do it. But we have to be organized too, guys. And that's what I'm saying is we need to be coherent, and we need to keep it about politics. We need to convince people that our position is correct, not that they're just a bunch of PMCs running around. No, 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 no. Let's keep it to the politics. And then when we struggle, then we can get into the class character of all of this. Then we can talk about the class character of ideology. We got to take this step by step. So that's what I think about all this kind of just like leftist isolationism. It's almost like people want to be in their little bubbles. They don't want to interact with people. They don't want to connect. Like, if they want I guess they want the algorithm to be boosted. So, that's how they do it. But I don't do it that way. That's why I'm always like, look, if you can support me, do it so on Patreon, do so through the various work that I'm doing. Not just because I'm talking trash about other people like that. If I'm going to be criticizing, which we need very solid criticism of the left, I'm going to be doing it. And I'm going to be doing it from the perspective of politics and what's going to move us forward. So I don't see any other questions, and we have just a couple of minutes left. So yeah, some house cleaning. I will be posting clips of my live stream that was just me. I'll try to do some more of those, guys. Some more live streams of just me. Some people have suggested I get a Twitch and I get other things. It's a lot of time consuming things. I'm actually going to be starting on a podcast app soon, which is more just, it's all over the phone. You've probably seen it, Colin. I'm going to be starting with them once the Android app comes out. But I will definitely be, trying to spread that, share that. I'll need all of you guys and all of you peoples to help me with that, help boost that pod that I'm going to launch. And probably I'm going to give it a month time. So that's going to be happening. That's very exciting. And I'm going to be trying to do more of these. So I've been trying to get guests. It's been hard to get guests. So, if you subscribe to me on Patreon, if you are on my Substack, whatever, definitely send me suggestions. I am looking for guest suggestions. I do have a big list, but people are busy, and I'm trying to make it so that I have some solid guests on for you all. And yeah, we got one last question. This is a good one, actually. Do you think it's worthwhile to try to relocate to a communist country for greater safety versus COVID? This is a tough one for me. It's tough because one of the contradictions of being so solid on COVID-19 from these countries is that it's actually extremely difficult to get there. Believe me, I've looked, I've searched, not because I was trying to escape, because I just want to travel back to China at some point. And I know this isn't going away anytime soon, given the complete negligence of the United States and the West. But if you go to China, for example, you're going to be in quarantine for 21 days. I know they're making exceptions with the Olympics. That's only because they are creating an entire bubble. They've created an entire bubble for the Olympics. And that is why there's an exception being made in order to have this event, because, you can't quarantine everyone for 21 days. given the logistical nightmare that would be bringing in people from all over the world and different times. And so, but there is a very strict bubble, and it's working and it's great. But yeah, it's hard to get to China. With Cuba, DPRK is already just very difficult to travel to. I'm sure we cannot get there. I'm sure DPRK wouldn't accept people if you were to go. But Cuba may be more of a possibility because, there are delegations that go regularly. In terms of staying there, I'm a little weary of that. There is this a phenomenon in the world of just, rich people going around the world, staying in countries, poor countries, oppressed countries, countries that have been ravaged by imperialism, staying there and just doing more damage to their economies, to their societies. And while I don't think you would be doing that, and while I don't think uh, socialist countries are the same, so to speak, some in development levels because of sanctions, let's say Cuba, has some economic definitely commit comparisons to its neighbors in Latin America and the Caribbean, but standard of living, of course, is higher than most countries. But still, I'm a little weary about that, about just going there. I get it. Safety from COVID-19 is a real concern, and I'm not going to tell anyone on here that they shouldn't be concerned about it. Now, do I think that the fear mongering of the establishment is positive? No. Do I think that some of the policies that the establishment have imposed are positive? No, because they haven't mitigated COVID-19, and they've left the floodgates open for a lot of confusion, which we are seeing happening right now. But at the same time, it's hard for me to advocate that people go travel and live somewhere else. It's hard. I don't know. I think people should do anything they can to be safe from COVID-19. That one, though, that one gets me thinking. So thanks for that question. So here we go. Connie Reed. I'm gonna keep. I see question. When I see a question, I'll answer it. Why not? And I know you're a regular, Connie. Thanks so much. So this question is. Oh man, I lost it. Okay, here we go. I may have just missed your answer because my twin. Hey, you have a twin. Very cool. Talk to me. But if not, are there any forums for sharing amateur writing about imperialism for people who want to learn to improve? Ooh, that's interesting because I don't participate in any. Now, I've gotten this question from subscribers, and I'll answer, not in terms of the forums, are there forums, but people asking me for advice. I think we need more of this. I'm not familiar with any. But Connie, I'm not going to say you have to like go behind the paywall to get advice from me. So if you hit me up on social media, I'm likely to answer you as well in time when I get the chance. Because unfortunately, when I'm not on this, I'm writing, or I feel bad sometimes because I want to treat. I'm not a paywall guy, so I want to treat everyone equally. But because Patreon is kind of like a daily thing, I do see messages there more, so I do answer, and I do prioritize you. I guess if you could say, I do answer people there a little bit more. So for those who are able to subscribe, I have, and maybe some subscribers can attest to this. I do communicate with you, and I try to help you all out if you are seeking advice, and for what I can give. So no, I don't know of any forums, but if you want to shoot me questions, sure. My one piece of advice for improving is to continue to study, 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 study. The more voices you hear from the correct political perspective, from the anti-imperialist political perspective, the better you get at writing. And practice, practice, practice. It's nerve-wracking for sure. When I started writing in 2010, 11, I was like a race-only guy, so I was still in my liberal bubble at a university, but I was a working-class kid, so I was still very much insecure about writing, and my politics were just kind of muddled. I was talking about racism a lot, but I didn't know much about certain topics, and I felt insecure about talking about things. So it takes some time to ease that anxiety because these are hard topics, these are heavy topics, these are very relevant to actual people, and so there's a lot of responsibility that comes to bear with that. But the more you practice and the more we read, study, listen, participate, and practice, the better you get. And I totally encourage, anybody who has advice about this. If you see me as somebody who could give it, I'm still learning myself and believe that I'm still in this process of self-correction, criticism. But if you see anything that you like and you want advice about how I'm doing it, sure, I can give more concretely as I think of it. So thanks for that question. Do you think lawmakers are making profits on pharmaceutical stocks? Of course. Definitely. That's just proven. And that's going to continue to happen. And, it's happening with the vaccines. Stephen said it. The vaccines are very profitable. They are leveraging public dollars to private corporations. And that is a definite contradiction that needs to be pointed out. Now, on the other hand, what we didn't talk about, well, which I will say, is that capitalism is full of contradictions. And one of those contradictions is that capitalism wants to reproduce itself. Capitalists want to reproduce themselves. So on the one hand, right, for people, especially oppressed people, the way, for example, how these measures were imposed in New York City, yeah, Black people were targeted and there was racism involved. There was a heavy-handed police state. We still see that with regards to like mask mandates and stuff, but and those kind of things. But masks in and of themselves as a public health measure were also a genuine public health measure on the part of capitalists to try to mitigate the spread in the least costly manner. And even then, the United States and the capitalist countries didn't have masks to begin with, which was pathetic. Still think back to those days. But nonetheless, that's how we should be looking at this, as a contradiction in motion, right? That's what capitalism is. So while the capitalists want to profit from everything that they do, they also want to reproduce themselves. They want to get people back to work. They want to have fewer disruptions, but they also do not want to put into place socialist-like policies, socialistic policies that require government intervention, public health intervention, funding for things that are somewhat, if not entirely, unprofitable, right? So that is, I think, how we should be looking at this. And I hope that we can get the conversation back to this, because this is how we understand political economy, is not just by talking about one side of something, right? We have to think about the entire form and shape of that contradiction. So Reddit forum, Substack. So Where is asking about that. No, I'm not really on those. It's hard for me to have time to really be on that all of the time. So my Substack is really for me. I'm not really on Reddit, but yeah, that's a good idea as well. If you want to go to Substack or Reddit forums, there might be other people doing this as well in terms of helping improve anti-imperialist journalism and writing. So thanks so much for those suggestions, helping each other out, like good comrades that you all are. So yeah, that's about it, guys. Good to be with all of you. Again, if you haven't liked the stream yet, do it before you leave. If you have not subscribed to this channel yet, do that before you leave. And if you are able to and have not done so yet, but want to do it after the stream, please do support this work, support this show, support my writing, support all that I do at patreon.com/JannyHaiphong. You can also do annual subscriptions at Substack, chroniclesofhaiphong.substack.com. There are also one-time donations in the description. All of this can be found in the description. And I look forward to seeing you all next time. Peace out.